The courtroom went silent when the judge said, "You have misunderstood your wife's financial position." My husband's smile vanished. Across the aisle, his mother's face drained of color. 3 weeks earlier, in our own kitchen, he had looked me in the eye and called me a parasite. He said it before he knew about the inheritance, before my grandfather's will, before the $28.7 million that would soon carry my name. Now the judge was about to read the number out loud. I sat with my hands folded in my lap, the way I had been sitting for the past 2 hours, the way I had been sitting for most of my marriage, quiet, composed, taking up as little space as possible. I was 42 years old. I had not earned a paycheck in 16 years, and in approximately 30 seconds, the man across the aisle was going to learn something about me that would rearrange every assumption he had ever made. The judge, a woman with steel gray hair, and a voice that sounded like she had heard every lie ever told in a Mississippi courtroom and had stopped being impressed decades ago, adjusted her reading glasses and addressed my husband by name. "Mr. Harrington, you appear to have misunderstood the financial position of your wife." Wade Harrington, 44, senior portfolio strategist at a firm whose name he dropped into conversations the way other men drop car keys on restaurant tables, sat across the aisle in a suit that cost more than most people's mortgage payments. He had walked into this courtroom with a rehearsed smile and the posture of a man who believed the outcome had already been decided. That smile was gone now. His attorney shifted in his chair like a man who had just realized the ground beneath him was not as solid as the retainer had promised. $28.7 million. The number hit the room like a dropped glass. "According to verified records," the judge continued, her voice flat and unhurried, "your wife's net worth is approximately $28.7 million. This figure represents an irrevocable family trust established independently of the marital estate." Behind Wade, in the second row of the gallery, his mother made a sound. Lorraine Harrington was 68 years old, a retired school lunch supervisor who had arrived that morning in a cream-colored suit as though appearance could substitute for innocence. She had been sitting with her purse in her lap and her chin lifted at the angle she always used when she wanted people to believe she was above whatever was happening around her. But when the judge said 28 million, Lorraine stood up so fast her chair scraped across the tile floor. The sound cut through the courtroom like a fingernail on glass. Then her knees buckled and she sat back down, both hands gripping the pew in front of her, her face the color of old paper. 28 million, she whispered, and the words dissolved into nothing. Wade did not look at his mother. He did not look at his attorney. He looked at me. He looked at me, the way you look at someone you realize you never actually knew. Beside me, Simone Prescott, my attorney, 55, reading glasses perpetually halfway down her nose as though the world required closer inspection, closed a folder without looking at it. She had prepared me for this moment. She had told me what the judge would say, how the numbers would land, what Wade's face would do when the architecture of his assumptions collapsed in public. She had been right about all of it. Wade leaned forward. His voice came out barely above a whisper, cracked at the edges, stripped of every polished cadence I had heard him use in 14 years of dinner parties and client calls. "You never told me." 3 words. As if the problem had always been my silence and never his contempt. I did not answer him. Not because I had nothing to say, but because the answer required more than a courtroom. It required going back to the night he had stood in our kitchen, 5 months before any of us sat in this room, 5 months before I knew about any trust or any inheritance, and called me something I will never forget. Parasite. He had called me a parasite, not after he learned about the money. Before. Months before. He said it to my face in our kitchen in Ridgeland, Mississippi, while our 13-year-old son listened from the hallway and our 9-year-old daughter slept upstairs. He said it because he believed it. Because to Wade Harrington, a wife who did not earn a paycheck was a wife who did not earn the right to be treated as an equal. That word parasite was never about the money. It was about who he had always believed I was. But to understand why that single word mattered more than any dollar amount the judge could read into the record, you need to come back with me. Not to the courtroom, not to the lawyers. Back to the evening it was first spoken, in a kitchen that smelled like reheated pasta, and the last ordinary night of my marriage. 5 months before that courtroom, before the lawyers and the judge and the number that made my mother-in-law collapse, my life looked completely ordinary. I was a wife, a mother, a woman who cooked dinner and drove carpool and signed permission slips and had not held a job title since I was 26 years old. I lived in a house with a man who came home every evening and kissed me on the forehead and made me believe that what I did mattered to him. I had no idea that the man sleeping beside me had already decided what that made me worth. For 16 years, I measured the success of my marriage by the things that never happened. No affairs, no screaming, no slammed doors. I told myself that was enough. I told myself that a quiet house meant a good one. I was wrong about that, but it would take me another 5 months to understand how wrong. Our life in Ridgeland ran on a schedule I could have recited in my sleep. Wake the children at 6:30. Pack lunches by 7. Drive Declan, my 13-year-old, a quiet 8th grader with my watchful eyes and his father's stubborn jaw, to the middle school by 7:40. Drop Poppy, my 9-year-old, the kind of child who still believed Band-Aids could fix anything, at the elementary school 10 minutes later. Groceries on Monday. Laundry folded by noon. Dinner on the table by 6:30, because Wade liked to eat the moment he walked through the door and did not like to be asked to wait. Wade earned well. He made sure I knew it. Not loudly, never loudly. That was the trick of it. He would say things at dinner like, "You wouldn't understand its portfolio stuff, not grocery math," and smile as though he had paid me a compliment by acknowledging I understood groceries at all. Have you ever been so used to a sound that you forgot it was there until someone pointed out it had been a warning all along? That was what those remarks were. A frequency I had stopped hearing because it had been playing since the day I quit my job to raise our children. Poppy asked me one evening to help her with fractions. I pulled my chair next to hers at the kitchen table and started walking her through the problem. Wade glanced up from his phone across the table and said, without any malice in his voice, that was the part that made it stick, "At least someone in this house is learning numbers." Declan's pencil stopped moving. He looked at his father, then at me. I laughed it off the way I always did. I said something like, "Well, I can divide a casserole into 6 portions, so I think I'm doing fine." Wade chuckled. Declan did not. I thought that was what patience looked like. I thought absorbing those small cuts was the price of a stable home. I did not realize I was teaching my son what a marriage looked like, and that he was paying closer attention than either of us knew. The phone call came on a Tuesday in late July. I was standing at the kitchen sink with my hands in warm dishwater, scrubbing the pot roast pan, when my phone buzzed on the counter. The number was a Jackson area code I did not recognize. My grandfather wore the same canvas jacket for 30 years, and never once told me he was proud of me in words. He just showed up every single time without being asked. Eugene Ballard was 84 years old, a retired timberland investor who had spent his life buying acreage in southern Mississippi that other people thought was worthless, and holding it until the world caught up. He had raised me more than my own parents had, in the quiet way that grandfathers do, fishing trips, road maps spread across the kitchen table. A brass lamp in his study that he let me turn on and off as a girl, because he said it made the room feel like ours. Simone Prescott's voice was gentle on the other end. "Corinne, I'm sorry to tell you your grandfather passed this morning. He went peacefully." I did not sit down. I stood at the sink with the water running over my hands and watched the suds slide off the pan and disappear down the drain. The kitchen smelled like pot roast and dish soap, and the coffee I had poured 2 hours ago and forgotten on the counter. "Did he leave any instructions?" I asked, because that was the kind of question you ask when the real questions are too large to hold. "We'll discuss everything at the reading next week," Simone said. "For now, Just be with your family. I hung up and stared at the refrigerator. There were magnets from Natch's little painted pelicans Eugene had given the children on our last visit. Poppy had arranged them in a row. They were still there. He was not. Grief is strange, it does not knock. It just sits down at your kitchen table like it has always lived there. When Wade came home that evening, I told him. I was standing in the same spot by the sink, the kitchen cleaned, the children upstairs. He set his briefcase on the counter and loosened his tie. "I'm sorry, honey," he said. Then, before the silence had even settled, Did your grandfather still own that land down in Natchez?" I thought he was making conversation. I thought it was his way of connecting the man to something tangible, the way some people process death by organizing the details around it. I said yes, I thought so, and he nodded slowly, and I went back to wiping down a counter that was already clean. I did not notice that he never actually said he was sorry about the man, only curious about what the man left behind. That night, after the children were in bed, I mentioned the will reading to Wade. He offered to take the afternoon off, to come along. At the time, I thought it was kindness. I had no idea he had already started paying attention to my grandfather's finances long before that phone call ever came. The conference room smelled like leather and old paper, and my grandfather's entire life had been reduced to a stack of folders no thicker than a phone book. Wade had taken the afternoon off without being asked twice. He wore his best client meeting shirt, the blue one with the French cuffs, and held the door open for me at Simone's office like a man arriving at a business opportunity, not a funeral matter. I should have noticed that. I did not. Simone sat across from us at a mahogany table with the blinds half drawn against the Jackson afternoon. Poppy whispered something to Declan near the window. He shushed her gently. I folded my hands and tried to remember how to breathe. "Your grandfather established an irrevocable family trust in 2014, Simone began, her voice measured and careful. The way you speak when you know the words you are about to say will rearrange someone's understanding of their own life. The principal beneficiary of this trust is you, Corinne. Your grandfather structured it years ago specifically in your name." I heard the words. I understood them individually, but together, they made no sense. Eugene Ballard had driven the same 10-year-old Buick until the odometer stopped working. He wore a canvas jacket so old the elbows had been patched twice. He ate breakfast at the same diner in Natchez every Saturday morning and left a $2 tip because he said the waitress had been there as long as he had. My grandfather had hidden an empire inside that ordinary life. Timberland holdings across southern Mississippi, commercial properties in Natchez and Jackson, diversified investment accounts, and he had left all of it to me. "Why didn't he ever tell me?" I asked. Simone offered a small, knowing smile. "Because Eugene believed knowing too early could change the way people treated you." I did not understand that sentence then. I would understand it perfectly within 5 months. The total value was not disclosed that afternoon. Simone said final appraisals were still pending. The timberland alone required independent surveys, and 2 commercial properties had lease agreements that needed review. She walked me through the structure patiently. Irrevocable meant no one could alter or dissolve the trust, not even me. It had been built to protect, not to spend. Eugene had designed it that way on purpose. Have you ever watched someone's face change in real time? Not dramatically. Not like in the movies, but just enough that you feel something shift, even if you cannot name it? That is what happened to Wade during the reading. When Simone said irrevocable, his jaw tightened by a fraction. When she listed the asset categories, timberland, commercial real estate, investment accounts, he leaned forward in his chair. Not the way a husband leans toward his grieving wife. The way a man leans toward a spreadsheet. I was too deep in my own grief to register it. I was thinking about Eugene's brass lamp and the way he used to let me turn it on when I was a girl. I was thinking about the magnets on my refrigerator. I was not thinking about the man sitting next to me and what his posture meant. Afterward, walking to the car, Wade asked the question he had been holding since the conference room. "How much are we talking about, Corinne?" His voice was quiet. controlled. The tone he used on client calls when he wanted information without revealing how much he already knew. "I don't know yet," I said. "Simone said the appraisals could take weeks." "You must have some idea," he pressed. I looked at him. His face did not look like a husband relieved for his wife. It looked like a man running numbers behind his eyes while his mouth said the right things. But I was holding a folder full of my dead grandfather's paperwork, and my 9-year-old was tugging my sleeve asking if we could get ice cream, and I did not have the energy to examine a feeling I could not yet name. In the car, on the way home, Wade recalibrated. His voice softened. He reached across the console and squeezed my hand the first time he had touched me all day and said, "Whatever your grandfather left, we need to make smart decisions together. We're a family. If you have ever trusted someone so completely that you stopped reading their face for signals, you will understand why I heard that word family and felt safe instead of warned. We need to discuss how to handle everything," he said, merging onto the highway. "Together, as partners." I nodded. I believed him. The word family had always meant safety to me. That afternoon, for the first time, it sounded like something else, but I could not figure out what. So I let it go. I watched the pine trees blur past the window and held my grandfather's folder against my chest, and told myself that whatever was coming, at least I would not face it alone. That evening, Wade sat at his laptop longer than usual. He said he was catching up on work emails. I went to bed without thinking twice about it. I kissed him on the top of his head the way I did every night, and he did not look up from the screen. I would not learn until months later that the first search he typed that night had nothing to do with work and everything to do with Mississippi trust law. It started with one question a night, then 2, then 3, and somewhere between the second week and the third, I stopped believing he was asking because he cared. I did not know yet what Wade had been searching for on his laptop that night after the will reading. I only knew that something had shifted in the air between us, the way the pressure drops before a storm you cannot see yet but can feel in your teeth. The kitchen island became his interrogation room. Every evening after dinner, after the children went upstairs, he would pour himself a glass of bourbon over ice and lean against the counter and start. "Have you called Simone yet? We can't just sit on this, Corrine. We have a family to plan for." "I told you the appraisals take time. Time is money," he said, swirling the glass. Literally, in this case. He said it with a half smile, as though it were a joke. It was not a joke. Nothing about the way he spoke about the trust was a joke. He used words like our future and our family, the way a locksmith uses a pick, inserting them gently, turning carefully, waiting for the click. When was the last time someone asked you about your money before they asked about your heart, and you pretended not to notice the order? Because that was what I did. I pretended. Every night for 6 weeks, Wade asked about the trust, what kind of properties, which counties, how many acres, when Simone would have final numbers. He asked if the trust could be restructured. He asked if beneficiaries could be added. He asked whether irrevocable really meant irrevocable or whether there were legal workarounds. He framed every question as partnership, as planning, as love. He never once asked whether I missed my grandfather. Not once. Not in 6 weeks of questions. Eugene had been dead for less than 2 months, and the man I had been married to for 14 years had not said his name a single time since the will reading. He referred to him only as your grandfather, the way you refer to a source rather than a person. I told myself it was just Wade being Wade practical, forward-thinking, wired to solve problems rather than sit inside feelings. I told myself that different people process grief differently, and that his way of honoring Eugene was to make sure the inheritance was handled responsibly. I told myself a dozen things that were easier than the truth. The truth found me on a Tuesday night in late September. I could not sleep. Wade was snoring lightly beside me, and the house was too quiet, and my mind would not stop turning. I went downstairs to the home office, his office really, though I used it sometimes for school forms and medical paperwork, and decided to organize the filing cabinet. Something to do with my hands. Something to make me feel like I had control over one small corner of my life. The filing cabinet smelled like dust and old tax returns, and somewhere in that ordinary smell was the first real evidence that my marriage was not what I thought it was. The folder was wedged behind 3 years of utility bills. Inside were refinancing papers from 2018 documents I remembered signing at the kitchen island, while Wade stood over me and said, "It's routine, just your signature on the second page." There was an account authorization form I did not remember at all, granting Wade signatory access to a joint investment account I had apparently opened. My signature was on the bottom line. The date was in my handwriting, but I had no memory of reading the terms because I had not read them. He had told me it would only take a minute. He had told me it was nothing. I sat on the floor of the home office with those papers spread across my lap and felt something cold settle in my stomach. This was 2018, 3 years before Eugene died. 3 years before any inheritance, any trust, any fortune. There was no money to chase back then, just a stay-at-home wife who signed what her husband put in front of her because she believed that was what trust looked like. A signature you give in trust is just ink until the day you realize it was a door you opened without ever checking what was on the other side. I read every page. The refinancing had shifted the mortgage into Wade's name alone, reducing my equity to 0. The authorization form gave him full access to an account funded with a small inheritance I had received from my grandmother years earlier. Money I had never tracked because Wade told me he was managing it. I did not know whether any of it was still there. I did not know how to check. What I did know, sitting on that carpet at 1 a.m, with dust on my fingers and cold coffee on the desk and the filing cabinet still open behind me, was that this was not new. This was not a reaction to Eugene's trust. This was a pattern quiet, methodical, years old, and I had signed my way through every step of it without asking a single question. I put the documents in a separate drawer and locked it. I told myself I was just being organized. I did not yet understand that those papers would matter, not because of what they gave Wade access to, but because of what they proved about the kind of man he had been all along. The leak did not start with malice. It started with sweet tea and a woman who had never learned to keep interesting news to herself. I did not know any of this at the time. I was still at home in Ridgeland, still locking drawers and telling myself I was being organized. But 20 miles away in Madison, in a living room filled with porcelain figurines and lavender air freshener, the first domino was already falling. I would piece this together months later, from fragments and confessions and one very uncomfortable conversation at a kitchen table. But I will tell it to you now the way it happened, because the order matters. Nadine Whitfield was 65 years old and had worked the front desk at Magnolia Trust Services for 19 years. She was Lorraine's oldest friend from church, the kind of woman who brought casseroles to funerals and opinions to everything else. She visited Lorraine most Wednesdays for sweet tea and conversation, and on the first Wednesday of October, she brought something extra. "We've been processing this estate for weeks now," Nadine said, stirring her glass with one finger, the way she always did. "Timberland, commercial lots, investment accounts. Whoever's inheriting it has no idea how their life is about to change. If you have ever watched someone smile while handing a loaded weapon to the person who would use it against you, and they called it friendship, then you understand what happened in that living room." Lorraine did not ask directly. She was too careful for that. She tilted her head and said, "A local family, you said? Anyone I might know?" And Nadine, who had never met a silence she did not feel compelled to fill, gave enough details: the county, the type of holdings, the timeline for Lorraine to connect the dots to Eugene Ballard's death and my will reading. She did not need a name. She already had one. Lorraine called Wade that evening. I do not know exactly what she told him, but I know what changed. Within days, the man I had been married to for 14 years became someone I barely recognized. The questions about the trust did not stop, but they sharpened. They lost the soft edges of partnership and took on the clean, cold precision of an audit. He stopped using the word our. He started using the word the trust, the properties, the situation. As though my grandfather's legacy was a problem to be managed rather than a gift to be grieved. He began scrutinizing things he had never noticed before. One evening, he picked up a grocery receipt from the counter and held it between two fingers like a piece of evidence. $42 on organic milk and fruit snacks, he said. You know what my analyst spent that on? A business lunch that actually generated revenue. He said it casually, the way he said everything that was designed to cut with a half smile, as though he were being clever rather than cruel. I stood at the sink and said nothing. I had learned by then that responding only extended the conversation, and extending the conversation only gave him more surface area to work with. I used to leave his hand on my shoulder when he passed behind my chair. That October, he stopped. I noticed the absence before I understood the reason. He stopped kissing me goodnight. He stopped asking about my day. He started coming home later and leaving earlier and spending his evenings in the home office with the door closed. When I knocked once to bring him coffee, he minimized his browser before turning around. The children noticed. Of course they did. Children always notice. They are smaller than adults, but their vision is sharper because they have not yet learned to look away from the things that hurt. It was a Thursday in late October. We were at the dinner table pot roast again, because it was the only meal I could cook on autopilot while my mind ran circles around everything I could not say out loud. Declan was quiet. He had been quiet for weeks. The kind of quiet that a 13-year-old uses when he is listening harder than anyone realizes. Wade was scrolling his phone between bites. I was cutting Poppy's meat into smaller pieces because she still liked it that way. A 9-year-old should not have to ask her parents if they are okay, and a mother should not have to lie when she answers. Daddy, Poppy said, in that small, clear voice she used when she was afraid of the answer. Are you and Mom okay? Wade did not look up from his phone. I put my hand over hers under the table and squeezed. Everything's fine, baby, I said. It was the first lie I told my daughter that I could not convince myself was harmless. Declan looked at me from across the table. He did not say anything, but his eyes said he knew. He knew I was lying, and he knew why. That night, after the children went to bed, I heard Wade's phone buzz on the kitchen counter. He picked it up, read the screen, and then did something I had never seen him do before. He smiled at his phone, the way a man smiles when he has just received very good news. Not warm news, not family news. The kind of news that confirms a plan is working. I would not learn what that message said for months, but when I did, it would explain everything. I found the envelope on a Tuesday morning, tucked beneath his laptop, as though hiding it had been an afterthought rather than a plan. I had not stopped thinking about that smile, the one Wade gave his phone in the kitchen, the one that had nothing to do with warmth. It sat in my mind like a splinter I could feel, but could not reach. And then, 3 days later, while he was at work, and the children were at school, and the house was so quiet, I could hear the refrigerator humming 2 rooms away. I walked into the home office to look for a school form and found something worse. The envelope was cream-colored, heavy stock, the kind that law firms use because cheap paper sends the wrong message. The return address was embossed in dark blue, a family law practice in Jackson. Not Wade's corporate firm, not his financial advisor. Family law. I did not open it. My hands were shaking enough to prove I wanted to. I stood in that office with Wade's aftershave still faint in the air and his laptop still warm on the desk, and I held the envelope by its corner like it might detonate. But something told me that the moment I opened it, The life I knew would officially be over, and I was not ready for that. Not yet. Not standing alone in a room that smelled like his cologne and the dishwasher detergent drifting in from the kitchen. There is a particular kind of silence that fills a house when one person is hiding something and the other has just found out. It sounds exactly like normal, except it hums. I photographed the return address with my phone. I put the envelope back exactly where I found it, angled the same way, the same corner tucked beneath the laptop's edge. Then I sat on the edge of the desk chair and pressed my palms flat against my thighs and breathed until my hands stopped shaking. For 3 days, I watched him. He kissed my forehead before leaving for work on Wednesday. He asked Poppy about her spellings on Thursday. He brought home takeout on Friday because he said I deserved a night off from cooking the first time he had said that in months. He acted like a man with nothing to hide, and that terrified me more than the envelope itself. Because a man who is careless with his secrets is one thing. A man who can conceal them behind forehead kisses and Friday night takeout is something else entirely. Have you ever asked someone a question you already knew the answer to? Not because you needed the information, but because you needed to hear whether they would lie? On Saturday evening, after the children went upstairs, I asked. We were in the kitchen. He was pouring bourbon. I was standing by the same sink where I had been standing when Simone called about Eugene. The same sink I seemed to end up at every time my life shifted beneath me. I saw the envelope on your desk, Wade, I said. From a family law firm. What is it? He did not flinch. He did not set down the glass. He poured the bourbon to exactly the level he always did, 2 fingers, no ice, and then he paused. Not the pause of a man caught off guard. The pause of a man selecting a response from a list he had already prepared. I'm considering all our options, he said. Every option, for the family. The word family again. The same word he had used in the car after the will reading. The same shield. What does that mean? I asked. He picked up his glass. He looked at me over the rim, not with guilt, not with anger, but with the flat patience of a man who has already decided the outcome and is simply managing the timeline. It means I'm being responsible, he said. Responsible, the way a man says it, when he means something else entirely and is counting on you not to ask which word he really meant. I waited for more. He walked to the living room without finishing the conversation. I heard the television turn on. I heard ice shift in his glass. I stood at the sink and gripped the edge of the counter and understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that he had rehearsed that answer. He had practiced those words the way he practiced client presentations, calm, controlled, designed to close a door without appearing to slam it. He never said the word divorce. He never said separation. He never said leaving. He gave me a wall of vagueness, so smooth there was nothing to grip, nothing to argue against, nothing to hold up and say this right here. This is the lie. His vague answer scared me more than honesty would have, because honesty, even brutal honesty, has edges you can work with. Evasion has none. Evasion is a man telling you everything is fine, while the exit papers sit under his laptop. That night, I lay in bed beside a man who had just refused to tell me whether he was leaving. I did not sleep. I listened to him breathe steady, unbothered, the rhythm of a person whose conscience was perfectly clear, and I realized that the thing I feared most was not the divorce itself. It was the possibility that he had been planning it for far longer than I had been afraid of it, that every forehead kiss and Friday takeout and carefully worded answer had been part of a schedule I was never meant to see. My son heard it before I did, standing barefoot in the hallway at 11 o'clock at night, listening to his father use words a 13-year-old should never have to translate. I did not know this happened until much later. Declan did not tell me. He carried it the way children carry things they do not understand, silently, carefully, like a glass filled too full. But the timestamp on his phone would eventually prove that he was the first person in this family to know the truth, and that he chose to protect me before I even knew I needed protecting. It was a Thursday in mid-November. I needed protecting. It was a Thursday in mid-November. Declan got up for a glass of water sometime around 11. The hallway was dark. The home office door was closed, but not latched the way it sat when Wade thought everyone was asleep and did not bother pulling it shut all the way. Blue light from his phone leaked through the gap. Declan stopped. He did not mean to listen, but Wade's voice carried the way it always did when he was giving instructions, clear, measured, the tone of a man who expected compliance. "We need to move on the filing before she gets her own counsel involved," Wade said. "The sooner we establish the narrative, the better." Declan did not know what filing meant in a legal context. He did not know what establish the narrative meant. But he knew his father was talking about his mother, and he knew the voice Wade was using was not the voice of a man solving a problem. It was the voice of a man executing a plan. A 13-year-old boy texting his aunt at midnight because he cannot tell his mother what he just heard. That is not childhood. That is a kind of war no child should have to fight. Declan went back to his room. He sat on his bed in the dark and typed a message to Faye Ballard Norris, my younger sister, 38, a guidance counselor at a high school in Hattiesburg, the kind of woman who answered every phone call and every text no matter the hour, because she believed that people only reach out at midnight when the daytime options have run out. Dad was on the phone talking about filing something. Mom doesn't know. I'm scared. Faye's reply came within 2 minutes. I hear you, sweetheart. Save this message. I love you. We'll figure it out. Save this message. Faye knew. She understood, in 2 minutes, what I would not understand for weeks, that the text was not just a cry for help. It was a timestamp. It was evidence. It was a 13-year-old boy's handwriting on the wall, dated and delivered, and it would matter later in ways none of us could have predicted. I knew none of this. I was asleep, or trying to be. What I did know was that 4 days later, on a Sunday afternoon, Lorraine arrived at my front door without calling first. Have you ever sat across from someone who smiled at you while searching for something behind your eyes and realized the smile was not affection, but reconnaissance? Lorraine brought cookies. She always brought cookies when she wanted something, the way some people bring flowers to hospitals, not because they care about the patient, but because empty hands feel wrong in a place where something is dying. She sat in my living room and accepted tea and complimented the curtains, and then, with the practiced ease of a woman who had been rehearsing her lines in the car, she turned the conversation. Has that attorney of yours finished sorting through everything Eugene left? She asked, stirring her tea with one finger. Those old properties in Natchez must be worth something by now. I kept my face still. We're still working through it. Well, you should be careful, dear, she said, and her voice dropped half a register, the register she used when she wanted to sound concerned, but was really issuing instructions. Big decisions need both partners at the table. Both partners. The same phrase Wade used. The same shield word, family, partners, together deployed with the same careful inflection, as though they had divided the script between them and rehearsed their scenes separately. I gave her nothing. I said the appraisals were ongoing. I said Simone was handling everything. I thanked her for the cookies. She left 40 minutes later, and the house smelled like her lavender perfume for hours afterward. Lorraine left the house, smelling of lavender and leaving behind the faint impression that my living room had just been searched without a single drawer being opened. After her car pulled out of the driveway, I stood at the kitchen window and replayed every word. The properties in Natchez. Both partners at the table. She had not asked a single question about how I was doing. Not one question about grief, or loneliness, or the children, or how it felt to lose the man who had raised me. She had asked exactly the same questions Wade had been asking for weeks in the same order, with the same careful tone, circling the same target. I pressed my thumb hard against the edge of the countertop and felt the ridge bite into my skin. The tea she had left behind sat on the side table, untouched and cooling. The cookies sat on their plate, perfectly arranged. Everything she had brought was a prop. Everything she had said was a probe. This was no longer just my husband's plan. His mother was in it too, and the two of them had been building something behind my back quietly, deliberately, in tandem, while I stood at the sink and made dinner and told my daughter everything was fine. He did not ease into it. He walked through the front door on a Tuesday evening, set his briefcase on the counter, and told me he had filed for divorce as though he were announcing a change in dinner plans. I had spent days since Lorraine's visit stacking her words against Wade's, looking for the match I already knew was there, but nothing prepared me for how it would actually arrive. "I filed this afternoon," he said. He did not sit down. He stood on his side of the kitchen island and loosened his tie. "I think it's the right thing. For both of us. For both of us." As if I had been consulted. As if this were a mutual conclusion rather than a detonation he had planned in secret with his mother and his attorney while I made dinner and drove carpool and told my daughter everything was fine. "Why now?" I asked. My voice was steady. "I do not know how." "What changed, Wade? Tell me what changed." He picked up an orange from the fruit bowl and turned it in his hand, the way he did when organizing his thoughts into a presentation. "Nothing changed. That's the problem. 16 years and nothing has changed. You don't work. You don't earn. You don't contribute anything that shows up on a bank statement. There is a word that once spoken by the person who promised to love you can never be unheard, not by you, not by the children standing behind him, not by anyone who will ever hear the story of your marriage. I have given 16 years to this family," I said. "I have raised your children. I have run this house." "Run this house," he repeated, and the careful mask slipped. Beneath it was something older, something that had been sitting behind his eyes for years, waiting for permission to speak. "You've run this house. That's what you think you've done." He set the orange down. He looked at me the way a man looks at something he has already decided to throw away. "You've always been a parasite who never earned a dime, and I'm done pretending that's enough." Parasite. He said it the way you say a fact you have believed for years, and finally decided to stop polishing into something polite. The word landed like the physical thing. I felt it hit my chest. The room went very still and very bright. The pendant light too harsh. The tile floor too cold. I opened my mouth to respond, to scream, to cry, to tell him that raising 2 children while he climbed his career ladder was not nothing, was not parasitic, was not something that deserved that word from the man who had benefited from every minute of it. And then I saw them. Poppy was standing in the kitchen doorway. Declan was behind her, one hand on the doorframe. They had come downstairs at the raised voices, still in their pajamas. Poppy's hand was reaching for Declan's sleeve the way she always reached for the nearest solid thing when she was frightened. My daughter was 9 years old. She did not know what a parasite was, but she knew what her father's face looked like when he meant what he said, and she would remember that face for the rest of her life. Declan's jaw was tight. It tightened the exact way his father's did when he was trying not to cry, and the resemblance felt like a knife turning. I chose silence. Not because I had nothing to say, I had everything to say. But my children were watching, and I refused to let them see me shatter in front of the man who had just reduced their mother's life to a single word. Wade walked out without looking back. The garage door opened, then closed. His car faded down the street until the house held the wrong kind of quiet, the kind that fills the space where a family used to be. I knelt on the cold tile and put my arms around both of them. Poppy's shoulders were trembling. Declan stood rigid, his hand still on the doorframe. I said nothing. There was no sentence that could explain what had just happened to a 9-year-old and a 13-year-old who had heard their father call their mother worthless. We stayed like that until Poppy's breathing slowed. I carried her upstairs. I tucked her in. I sat on Declan's bed until he pretended to fall asleep, and I pretended to believe him. Then I went downstairs to the kitchen table, took a notebook and a pen, and wrote down every word Wade had said, the date, the time, the exact phrase. My handwriting was shaking. I pressed the pen harder. I did not know yet why I was doing it. I only knew that this word, spoken on this night, before he knew a single thing about the inheritance, mattered, and I was not going to let it disappear. Poppy was sitting up in bed, with her knees pulled to her chest, when I opened her door, and the look on her face told me she had not stopped hearing her father's voice since the kitchen. The notebook was still downstairs on the table, the ink still drying on the words I had written. But those words could wait. My daughter could not. I sat on the edge of her bed. The lavender comforter was bunched around her legs. Her strawberry poo was on the pillow. The nightlight cast a pale stripe across her face, and in that light she looked younger than 9. She looked like the girl who used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms, convinced that being between her parents meant nothing could hurt her. "Mom," she whispered, "are you okay? What Daddy said, is it true?" I smoothed her hair back from her forehead. I held my voice steady, the way you hold a glass filled to the brim carefully, because one wrong movement would spill everything. "No, sweetheart, what your father said is not true. Not even a little bit." She believed me. I could see it in the way her shoulders dropped, in the way her grip on the comforter loosened. But I also knew that believing your mother is not the same as unhearing your father, and she would carry both for a very long time. If you have ever had to lie to your child about whether you were okay, and felt the lie land perfectly because they needed it to, then you know the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being believed. I stayed until she fell asleep. Her breathing slowed. Her hand relaxed against the pillow. I pulled the comforter up to her chin and stood in her doorway for a long time, watching the nightlight flicker, thinking about all the things a 9-year-old absorbs without knowing she is absorbing them. The way her father stood when he was angry, the word he chose, the way her mother knelt on the kitchen floor afterward and said nothing. She would remember all of it. I could not undo that. I could only decide what happened next. 2 weeks later, I sat in Simone Prescott's office in downtown Jackson. Traffic hummed on Capitol Street below the window. Simone's reading glasses caught the overhead light as she opened a folder and placed it between us on the conference table. "The final appraisals are still pending on 2 properties, she said, clicking her pen once the way she always did before delivering something significant. "But the current estimate for the total trust value is approximately $28.7 million. I heard the words. I understood them separately. Together, they sounded like a language I had not learned yet. 28, I started. "Million," Simone said. "Yes, $28.7 million. I had spent 16 years worrying about grocery budgets and school fees, and my grandfather had been quietly building a fortune I never knew existed. I picked up the glass of water from the table, the only thing I could swallow, and drank slowly while the number settled into the room. The valuation document sat in front of me, the figure printed in black ink on white paper, clinical and precise. Timberland, commercial real estate, investment accounts. Everything Eugene had built with his quiet hands and his canvas jacket and his 10-year-old Buick. But the number did not make me feel rich. It made me feel something I had not expected: clarity, because the math was simple now. Wade had called me a parasite 3 weeks before I sat in this chair, 3 weeks before either of us knew this number existed. He had not said it because he discovered I was hiding money. He had not said it because the inheritance threatened him. He said it because he meant it, because to him, a wife who did not earn was a wife who did not count. The hatred came first. The money just gave it a price tag. The money did not change who Wade was, it simply removed the last excuse I had been giving him for free. I set the water down. I looked at Simone across the table, her reading glasses, her patient hands. The quiet authority of a woman who had spent 30 years watching marriages come apart in her conference room and knew the difference between the ones that ended with dignity and the ones that ended in wreckage. "I don't need to hide this number," I said. I had not planned to say it. It came out fully formed, like something that had been building behind my ribs for weeks and finally found the door. I need to prove when he said what he said, and that he said it before either of us knew this existed. Simone leaned back in her chair. She took off her glasses and looked at me, not the way an attorney looks at a client, but the way a woman looks at another woman who has just walked through a fire and come out the other side holding the one thing that matters. "Then we start building the timeline," she said. "Tonight." I picked up the valuation folder. It was heavier than I expected, not because of the paper, but because of what it meant. This was not a secret to protect. This was not a weapon to hide. This was the proof that my husband's contempt had nothing to do with money and everything to do with who he had always been. And the timeline, the notebook on my kitchen table, the dates, the words was the thread that would stitch it all together. I had one question for my son, and everything depended on how he answered it. Simone and I had agreed to build the timeline that night. My handwritten notes from the kitchen were one layer dated, detailed, written in the raw hours after the insult. But Simone said one layer was not enough. We needed independent corroboration, something that existed outside my own account. I found it in Declan's bedroom on a Tuesday afternoon in early December. I was sitting at his desk doing homework. I knocked. He looked up with that guarded expression he had been wearing since the kitchen. The expression of a boy who has learned that the adults in his house are not as reliable as he once believed. I sat on the edge of his bed and asked the question as gently as I could. "Declan, the night your father said what he said in the kitchen, did you tell anyone?" His pencil stopped. He looked at the wall, then at me, and his voice cracked in a way that made him sound both 13 and much, much older. "I texted Aunt Faye that same night. I didn't know what else to do." I pulled him close and held him. His shoulders were rigid at first, the way boys hold themselves when they are trying not to need comfort, and then they softened. My 13-year-old had done something I had not even thought to do. He had created a witness without knowing he was creating evidence. My son had not tried to be brave that night. He had tried to be heard. And in doing so, he had given me the one thing no amount of money could buy: proof. I asked if I could see the messages. He handed me his phone without hesitation. I scrolled through the thread with Faye, his text sent at 11:14 that evening, her reply at 11:16. The words were simple and devastating. He had written exactly what he heard. The timestamp was automatic, uneditable, and it matched my handwritten notes to the minute. I took screenshots. I sent them to Simone from my own phone. Her reply came within the hour. "This is time-stamped, independent, and it matches your notes exactly. Corinne, this is very strong." If you have ever watched someone discover that the thing they dismissed a child's fear, a late-night text, a whispered confession, was the very thing that would save someone they loved, then you understand what I felt looking at that phone screen. I sat with Declan for a long time after that. I did not explain what the text meant legally. I did not tell him about the trust, or the money, or the strategy Simone and I were building. I just sat with him in his room while the December light faded outside his window and told him that what he did that night reaching out to Faye was exactly right. He nodded. He did not ask why it mattered. I think, on some level, he already knew. 3 weeks later, the second domino fell. I was not there for it, but I would learn what happened through fragments through Simone's legal filings, through phone records that would surface months later, through the particular shift in Wade's behavior that followed like a weather change. It happened in Lorraine's kitchen in Madison on an evening in late December. She sat Wade down and told him what she had been holding since October, what Nadine had shared about the Ballard estate. "That friend of mine at the trust company," Lorraine said. "She says the Ballard estate is not small, Wade. Not small at all. Timberland, commercial properties, investment accounts." Wade went quiet. The kind of quiet that is not stillness, but calculation. "How long have you known this?" he asked. "A few months," she said. "I wanted to be sure before I said anything." A few months. She had known since October. She had visited my living room, drunk my tea, complimented my curtains, and probed me about the Natchez properties, all while sitting on information she had already decided to deliver to her son when the timing was right. Wade was rebuilding his chessboard that night in his mother's kitchen, but the game had already been recorded, move by move, in a notebook and a teenager's text thread he did not know existed. I would learn the specific figures weeks later. But that night, standing in his mother's house with December cold pressing against the windows, Wade began recalculating. Not his marriage, not his family, his strategy. The divorce he had filed with contempt was about to become a divorce he filed with greed, and he did not yet understand that the shift itself would become evidence. Wade called his attorney before midnight. I know this because the phone records would eventually confirm it. He was recalculating, repositioning, preparing to rewrite the story he planned to tell in court. But the story had already been written in my handwriting on a notebook page, in my son's text messages to his aunt, in timestamps that could not be edited or erased or softened into something less damning. His words from the kitchen were already weeks old, documented, corroborated, waiting, and every move he made from this point forward would only prove what the timeline already showed, that the contempt came first and the money came second. The man who had called me a parasite 6 weeks earlier came home on a January evening with flowers and a voice so gentle it sounded like it belonged to someone else. I knew why. The timeline told me everything. His contempt had been documented in November. His mother had delivered the inheritance news in December. And now, in January, Wade Harrington arrived at the kitchen island with a grocery store bouquet still in its cellophane and a performance so transparent I could see the strings. "I've been thinking," he said, setting the flowers on the counter between us. He did not put them in water. He did not cut the stems. He placed them the way you place a prop: visible, functional, disposable. "Maybe I was too hasty. We should talk, really talk about where we stand. About us." The word us had not appeared in his vocabulary since before the filing. It had vanished the same night he walked out of the kitchen. Now it was back, freshly polished, offered up like a gift he expected me to unwrap with gratitude. "What changed your mind?" I asked. "I've had time to reflect," he said. He had not had time to reflect. He had had time to hear a number. There is a difference between a man who reconsiders his marriage because he misses his wife and a man who reconsiders because he has just learned what she is worth. The first one brings flowers because he is sorry. The second one brings flowers because he is recalculating. Have you ever watched someone try to put a mask back on after you have already seen the face underneath and realized they do not know you have seen it? That was January. Wade opened doors for me. He complimented dinner. He asked Poppy about her school project with a warmth that would have moved me 6 months earlier, but now felt like watching an actor rehearse a scene he had not fully memorized. He avoided the word divorce entirely. He spoke about the future in soft, vague terms, when things settle down, and, once we get through this rough patch, as though the filing, the attorney, the envelope on his desk, had been a misunderstanding rather than a plan. I responded politely. I gave nothing away. I cooked dinner and answered his questions and smiled at the right moments and waited. On a Tuesday evening, I told him the truth. "I think we should talk through our lawyers from now on," I said. His face tightened. The gentleness flickered like a lamp with a loose bulb, one moment warm, the next dark, then warm again as he caught himself and rearranged his expression into something that looked like hurt, but was really calculation interrupted. "If that's what you want." he said quietly. He picked up the flowers still in their cellophane, still unwatered, and set them in the trash on his way out of the kitchen. A man who files for divorce in a fury and then files to delay it in a whisper is not having second thoughts. He is having second calculations. 3 days later, Simone called me to her office. I drove to Jackson in the January rain, parked on Capitol Street, and sat in her conference room drinking coffee that was strong enough to taste like the first thing I had properly tasted in weeks. She placed a document on the table between us. It was stamped with a court filing date. His attorney filed to postpone the preliminary hearing, Simone said. He wants more time. More time for what? To figure out how much you are worth before he decides how to proceed. She let that sit. I picked up the filing and read it. The legal language was dense, but the intent was clear. The man who had rushed to file in November, who had told his attorney to move before I got my own counsel, was now asking the court to slow down. The urgency had evaporated. The strategy had reversed. He filed aggressively before he knew about the money, Simone said, tapping the document with her pen. Now he is pulling back. That shift in strategy is a timeline all by itself. If you have ever had someone treat you better only after learning you were worth more, you already know that kindness has a receipt, and someday you will find it. Simone leaned forward. She took off her reading glasses and looked at me with a small, precise smile, the kind of smile an attorney gives when the opposing side has just made a mistake they do not yet realize is irreversible. This is exactly what we need, she said. He is building our case for us. I set down the filing. I drank the last of my coffee, and I understood something I had not fully grasped before. Wade was not my opponent in this divorce. He was his own. Every move he made, the flowers, the soft voice, the legal delay, was another line on a timeline that would eventually speak louder than anything either of us could say in a courtroom. The November filing proved contempt. The January delay proved greed. And the gap between them, those 6 weeks when a number traveled from Nadine to Lorraine to Wade, proved that his entire case was built on the exact sequence he was trying to hide. The mediation was scheduled for the end of the month. And for the first time since November, I was not afraid of what would happen there. The mediation room had 1 window, 1 clock, and 1 long table. And by the time we were finished, everything Wade had spent 2 months constructing would be scattered across it in pieces. I had walked into that building prepared. Simone had spent the previous week organizing the evidence into a sequence she called the chain, each document leading to the next, each timestamp tightening the knot. She told me to sit still, say nothing, and let the paper do the talking. I did. Wade arrived with his attorney and the posture of a man who still believed he was in control. He wore the charcoal suit he saved for client-facing meetings. He carried a leather portfolio. He sat across the table from me and nodded once, as though we were colleagues meeting about a quarterly report rather than 2 people deciding how to divide 14 years. Simone did not make small talk. She opened the folder she had brought and began placing documents on the table, one at a time, in chronological order. The first was my handwritten record from the night of the insult, the notebook page, with the date, the time, the exact words. She set it on the polished wood without commentary, the way a dealer places a card face up. The second was a printout of Declan's text to Faye, sent at 11:14 that same evening, corroborating the event independently, time-stamped by the phone network. The third was the coerced refinancing document from 2018, proof that the pattern of financial control predated any inheritance by years. Simone did not raise her voice once. She simply placed paper on wood, 1 sheet at a time, the way a person lays cards face up when they already know they have won the hand. November 23rd, she said, touching the first document. Mrs. Harrington's handwritten record of the insult, dated the same evening. She touched the second. November 23rd, 11:14 p.m. A text from the Harringtons' 13-year-old son to his aunt, corroborating the event independently. She touched the third. A pattern of financial documents signed under pressure, dating back to 2018, 3 years before any inheritance existed. She paused. The clock on the wall ticked 3 times. December 19th, she continued. Mrs. Harrington first learns the trust valuation from my office. The sequence is clear. The insult, the filing, and the pattern of control all precede any knowledge of inherited assets. Mr. Harrington's claim that his wife concealed financial information is contradicted by his own timeline. 3 documents, 2 timestamps, 1 word spoken weeks before the money existed. That was all it took to turn his accusation inside out. Wade's attorney leaned back in his chair. He glanced at Wade, a quick, professional glance that carried a weight Wade probably felt but could not afford to acknowledge in a room with witnesses. Then he cleared his throat. We'd like a moment to— Of course, Simone said, but these are copies for your records. The originals are secured. She slid the folder across the table. Wade's attorney took it. They stepped into the hallway. The door closed behind them. The conference room went quiet. Winter light came through the single window and fell across the documents still spread on the table. My handwriting, my son's text messages, my signature on papers I had been too trusting to read. The evidence of my marriage, laid out in chronological order like an autopsy report. Wade sat across from me. He had not moved. His hands were on the chair arms, knuckles pale, jaw set in the expression he used when he was trying to look composed while everything behind it was collapsing. He did not look at Simone. He did not look at the documents. He looked at me. I had imagined this moment for weeks, the look on his face when the truth arrived. I thought it would feel like victory. Instead, it felt like watching a building come down in slow motion and knowing you once lived inside it. I didn't— He started, and then stopped. His voice had no polish, no presentation, no client call cadence. It was raw, stripped, the voice of a man whose script had just been taken away. I said nothing. Simone had told me to say nothing, and she was right. Silence in that room was louder than anything I could have offered. Wade's attorney returned after 7 minutes. I know because I counted the ticks on the clock. He suggested they table the discussion for today. The legal translation was clear. They needed time to regroup. The evidence had landed harder than they expected. Wade stood without speaking. He adjusted his cuffs, the old habit, the old armor. He picked up his coat from the back of the chair. He walked to the door. And then, in the doorway, he turned back. He looked at me. Not with anger. Not with the old superiority. Not with the rehearsed softness of January's flowers and fabricated warmth. This was something I had never seen on his face before, the blank, unsteady expression of a man who has just realized the room heard everything and none of it can be taken back. For the first time since the night he called me worthless in our kitchen, Wade did not know what to say. He stood in the doorway of that conference room with his coat over his arm and his mouth slightly open and nothing, absolutely nothing, coming out of it. Simone closed the folder. She looked at me across the table, and she nodded once, not with triumph, but with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had built something solid and watched it hold. Wade's silence lasted exactly 4 days, and when it broke loud, in the hallway of our own home, with his finger aimed at my chest like a weapon he had been saving. I had known it was coming. A man who leaves a mediation without words does not stay wordless for long, he reloads. And Wade had spent 4 days reloading. It was a Thursday evening. The children were at Faye's for the night. I was walking from the kitchen to the living room when he stepped into the hallway and blocked the path. The way you block a door you do not want opened. You knew about that money and you hid it, he said. His voice was too loud for the hallway, too loud for the house, too loud for a man who was supposed to be the composed one. You sat there for months playing the victim while you had millions sitting in a trust with your name on it. His finger was 2 inches from my collarbone. I did not step back. I had spent 16 years stepping back in this hallway, making room for his moods, adjusting my posture to fit the shape of whatever he needed me to be. Not tonight. You called me a parasite before you knew a single dollar existed, I said. My voice was level. My hands were still. You cannot claim contempt and greed at the same time, Wade. Pick one. If someone ever accuses you of hiding something they already told you was worthless, pay attention, because that contradiction is not confusion. It is the sound of a person whose story just stopped making sense. He stared at me. His finger dropped. His jaw worked the way it did when he was running through responses and finding none of them strong enough to say out loud. He settled on 5 words. This isn't over, he said. No, I agreed. It isn't, but for the first time, it is no longer yours to finish. He walked past me to the home office and closed the door. I stood in the hallway and listened to the silence. He left behind a different silence than before. Thinner, less certain. The silence of a man who had just swung at something and missed. 10 days later, Lorraine called. She did not ask me to come to her house. She suggested a cafe, a place on Town Center Boulevard in Ridgeland, with lace curtains and soft music, as though the setting could make what she was about to ask feel like kindness instead of coercion. I went because I wanted to hear what she would say. I ordered tea I did not intend to drink. Lorraine sat across from me in a blue cardigan and a string of pearls and the expression of a woman who had rehearsed her opening line in the car. I'm asking you, she said, wrapping both hands around her teacup without lifting it. As family, not to drag this through the courts. Think of the children. Think of what people will say. The children, people, family, the same shield words, deployed in the same order, with the same practiced warmth. I had heard this script before from Wade, from Lorraine, from the whole careful machinery they had built together. Lorraine, I said, what exactly are you asking me to do? I'm asking you to be reasonable, to settle this quietly. He was angry, yes. He said things we both knew he would say things, but that doesn't mean you have to use them against him. She said we both knew. The word both landed on the table between us, like something that had been kept in a pocket for too long and finally slipped out. What do you mean, we both knew? I asked. Her face changed. Not dramatically, just the smallest tightening around her eyes. The flicker of someone who has heard her own words played back and realizes, too late, what they revealed. I only meant he was under pressure. Anyone could see he might. You knew what your son was going to say to me, I said quietly. Before he said it, didn't you? Lorraine stared at her teacup. The steam rose between us. The cafe murmured around us other people's conversations, other people's ordinary afternoons. She did not answer. She did not need to. The silence was the answer, and we both knew it. Did you know what your son said to me, Lorraine? I asked again. Not louder, just clearer. She set her teacup down without drinking from it. She picked up her purse. She stood. I was only trying to help, she said, and walked out of the cafe without looking back. Her lavender perfume lingered in the booth for a long time after she left. The chair she had been sitting in was still warm. The tea was still full. I sat there watching the steam rise from my own untouched cup and thinking about the word both. She had known. She had always known. Not just about the inheritance. Not just about the filing, about the contempt, about the word, about the man her son had become and the things he was capable of saying to the mother of his children. She had known and she had chosen his side. Not because she believed he was right, but because she had spent her entire life choosing silence over truth. I just did not know why yet. What kind of man ignores his own lawyer's advice because admitting he was wrong feels worse than losing? Lorraine's slip at the cafe had confirmed what I suspected. The conspiracy ran deeper than strategy. But I did not have time to sit with that knowledge. The hearing was approaching. and Wade was about to make the decision that would seal his own fate. I heard it through the home office door on a Tuesday evening in mid-February. Wade was on the phone with his attorney, the same muffled cadence I had listened to from that hallway months earlier, except now the tone on the other end was different, urgent, almost pleading. I caught fragments through the door. "The evidence is strong. Consider negotiating. Exposure at trial." Wade's response was not muffled at all. "I don't care what they have," he said. "I'm not negotiating with someone who—" A pause, then harder. "No, we go to the hearing. I'm not giving her the satisfaction." He hung up. The office went silent. I stood in the hallway and listened to the nothing that followed the particular emptiness of a man sitting alone with a decision his own attorney told him was wrong. Pride is a strange thing. It looks like strength from the inside, but from the outside, it looks exactly like a man building a wall around the hole he is standing in. His own lawyer had told him the ground was gone, and Wade was still standing on it, refusing to look down. He would rather walk into a courtroom and lose publicly than sit at a table and admit privately that his wife had been right. I realized then that his pride was not a strategy. It was a cage, and he had locked himself inside it years ago. I walked away from the door. I did not confront him. There was nothing left to confront. A man who ignores his own attorney's advice is no longer fighting his wife, he is fighting himself. And that is a fight I did not need to win. He was losing it on his own. The harder question came a week later, in Simone's office. Declan sat beside me at the conference table, his backpack on the floor, his sneakers not quite reaching the carpet. Late afternoon light cut across the table between us. Simone removed her reading glasses and spoke carefully. "Declan's written statement would confirm the timeline independently," she said. "I want you to understand I am not asking for this lightly, but the hearing is in 2 weeks, and this could be decisive. There is a particular kind of pain that comes from knowing your child will have to choose between his parents in public, and knowing that the truth is on your side does not make it hurt less." "He's 13, I said. "I don't want him to have to stand against his own father." Simone nodded. "I understand, but the alternative is that his father's version of events goes unchallenged. The written statement may be enough. A brief verbal confirmation, if the judge requests one. Nothing adversarial." I looked at Declan. He was watching me the way he had been watching me for months, steady, careful, carrying something too heavy for his age with a composure that made my chest ache. "Before I tell you what my son said next, are you still with me? Because this is where everything turns. Comment what you think a 13-year-old boy should do here. Speak up or stay silent and tell me why. Please note, some details ahead are adapted for storytelling. The lesson is what I hope stays with you." "Mom," Declan said. His voice was quiet, but it did not waver. "I'll tell the truth. That's what you taught me to do." 9 words. 9 words from a boy who had spent months listening at hallway doors and texting his aunt at midnight and watching his parents come apart at the seams. And in that moment, he chose truth over comfort with the kind of certainty most adults never find. If your child has ever said something so simple and so brave that it made you want to cry and applaud at the same time, then you understand the exact feeling that passed through me in that chair. Simone looked at me. She did not push. She waited. "Are you sure?" I asked him. "I heard what Dad said," Declan answered. "And it wasn't true. You're not what he called you. Somebody should say that out loud." I put my arm around his shoulders and held him for a long time in that conference room. He did not pull away. He did not cry. He just sat there, steady, like a boy who had already decided what kind of man he was going to become. His shoulders were thin under my arm. His backpack sat on the floor with a math textbook sticking out of the top. He smelled like school hallways and the cheap body spray he had started wearing that year, because someone told him it was what 8th graders did. I did not know whether to feel proud or heartbroken, so I felt both at the same time, in equal measure. The hearing was in 12 days. The brass lamp on my grandfather's desk still worked. I tried it before I sat down, the way I always had as a girl, and the room came alive with the same warm light that used to make me feel like nothing bad could reach me here. 12 days had passed since Declan said those 9 words in Simone's office. The hearing was tomorrow, and I had driven 2 hours south to Natchez because there was one room left in the world where I could still hear my grandfather's voice. No one had cleaned the study since Eugene died. Faye told me she could not bring herself to do it. Neither could I until now. The timber survey map still hung on the wall in its oak frame. His reading glasses sat on the shelf beside a stack of agricultural quarterly magazines he would never finish. The leather chair was worn smooth on the left armrest, where he had rested his elbow for 40 years. Dust lay on every surface like a soft gray cloth, undisturbed, as though the room had been holding its breath. I sat in his chair. I opened the center desk drawer, looking for a photograph of the 2 of us at the Natchez fishing pier, the one he kept beneath his checkbook. The photograph was there, but beneath it was something else. A sealed envelope. Cream-colored, heavy stock. My name was written across the front in his careful block letters. The seal was not tape, it was wax, pressed with the old brass stamp he kept in the top drawer. He had written this deliberately. He had meant for me to find it. Have you ever opened a letter from someone who has already died and felt, for just a moment, like they were standing right behind you, waiting for you to read it? The date inside was 6 months before he passed. 6 months. He had known something I did not. The handwriting was steady, not the shaking hand of a man near death, but the deliberate strokes of a man who had something important to say and wanted to make sure every word was clear. Dear Corinne, it began. I have been thinking about how to say this for a long time, and I have decided that a letter is better than a conversation, because a conversation can be interrupted and a letter cannot. He wrote about watching my marriage. He wrote about a Thanksgiving dinner 3 years earlier, a dinner I barely remembered where he had sat across the table and watched Wade speak to me in a way that made him set down his fork. He spoke to you the way a man speaks to someone he has already decided doesn't matter, Eugene wrote. I said nothing because it was not my place, but I did something else instead. Let me tell you something about grandfathers who build things with their hands. They do not leave instructions because they expect you to be weak. They leave them because they know the world is. Eugene explained that he had restructured the trust after that Thanksgiving. He had made it irrevocable not just as a legal term, but as a wall engineered so that no one could alter it, dissolve it, or claim it in a divorce proceeding. Not Wade, not Lorraine, not anyone who shared my married name. Money can reveal who people truly are, he wrote, but your dignity was always the greatest inheritance I could leave you. The trust is yours. It was always yours. And it was built so no one could take it from you, not even someone who shares your last name. I set the letter down on the desk and pressed both palms flat against the leather surface. The lamp hummed. The room smelled paneling and old paper, and the faintest trace of pipe tobacco that had seeped into the walls over decades and would never fully leave. I had seen it. Years before the insult. Years before the filing. Years before I stood in my own and heard the word that would split my life in 2. My grandfather had watched from across a Thanksgiving table and recognized something I had spent 16 years refusing to name. And instead of telling me because he knew I would not have believed him, not then, he had built a fortress around me and waited for the day I would need it. I read the letter twice more. I ran my thumb over the broken wax seal and felt the rough edge where I had cracked it open. The stationery was thick, the kind he ordered from a catalog because he said proper letters deserved proper paper. His signature at the bottom was firm and unhurried. I did not cry. I had done enough crying in hallways and bathrooms and parked cars over the past 4 months. Instead, I folded the letter along its creases and placed it in my purse, next to the hearing notice Simone had given me that morning. There are moments that do not feel like turning points when they happen. They feel like silence, like stillness, like the click of a brass lamp turning off in an empty room. I turned off the lamp and stood in the dark. Tomorrow morning, I would drive back to Jackson, put on the gray suit Simone told me to wear, and walk into a courtroom where my husband would try to rewrite 14 years of marriage. But I had Eugene's letter in my purse, and I had the truth, and for the first time in months, those felt like the same thing. The metal detector beeped when I walked through it, and for one absurd second, I thought it had found the fear I was carrying. I had driven back from Natchez before dawn. Eugene's letter in my purse beside the hearing notice, the highway dark and empty ahead of me. I had put on the gray suit Simone told me to wear. I had brushed my hair and checked my reflection and told the woman in the mirror that today was the day she would stop being afraid. I was not entirely sure she believed me. Simone was waiting at the courthouse entrance. She walked beside me without speaking, her heels clicking on the polished floor, her folder held against her chest like a shield she did not need but carried out of habit. At the courtroom door, she stopped and looked at me. "Don't look at him," she said, her voice low and steady. "Look at the judge when she enters. You belong here." I pushed the door open. Wade was already seated at the opposing table. His suit was pressed to the point of rigidity. His posture was military straight, his jaw working in that small, rhythmic way it did when he was performing confidence rather than feeling it. He did not look at me. He looked at the table in front of him the way a man looks at a hand of cards he has not decided how to play. Behind him, 3 rows back in the gallery, sat Lorraine. She had worn her church dress, the navy one with the white collar, the one she saved for occasions where she believed appearance could stand in for innocence. Her purse was in her lap. Her eyes tracked me as I walked to my seat, and her expression was neither hostile nor sympathetic. It was the face of a woman who had made her choice and was waiting to see if it would cost her. A courtroom is just a room with better lighting and worse stakes, the same lies people tell at kitchen tables, except here someone is keeping score. Russell Foley, Wade's divorce attorney, sat beside him, a sharp-jawed man in his 50s, with a voice built for persuasion and a habit of pressing his fingertips together when he was about to deliver a line he had rehearsed. I had never met him before that morning, but I recognized the type. He was the kind of lawyer who turned financial facts into moral accusations and trusted that the volume of the charge would distract from the absence of evidence. The clerk called the room to order. Judge Meredith Caldwell entered from the side door, a woman in her early 60s with steel gray hair, reading glasses on a silver chain, and the particular authority of someone who had heard every version of every lie and was no longer impressed by any of them. She settled into her chair, arranged her papers, and opened the proceedings without ceremony. "This court is convened in the matter of Harrington versus Harrington," she said. "I have reviewed the preliminary filings. Counsel for the petitioner, you may proceed with your opening." I pressed my thumb against the edge of Eugene's letter through the lining of my purse. It was still there. I was still here. Foley stood. He buttoned his jacket, adjusted his cuffs, the same gesture Wade used, the same performance, and addressed the bench. If you have ever sat in a room while someone described you as a person you do not recognize, you know the particular violence of being lied about in a place where truth is supposed to matter. "Your Honor," Foley began, his voice carrying the measured outrage of a man who had practiced sounding appalled. The respondent was aware of a family trust valued at $28.7 million and took deliberate steps to conceal its existence from her husband, and from this court, effectively weaponizing marital assets during dissolution proceedings. He called the trust a hidden war chest. He said I had timed my silence to gain strategic advantage. He said the word deliberate 4 times in 3 minutes, as though repetition could make it true. The number landed in the courtroom the way it had landed in my life, heavy, disorienting, too large to hold. $28.7 million. He said it like it was a weapon, and in that courtroom, he was trying to make it one. I watched Wade while his lawyer spoke. He nodded once, a small, satisfied nod, as if someone had finally said the thing he had been waiting to hear, said out loud. He did not look at me. He looked at the judge, projecting the calm certainty of a man who believed the narrative had been set. Simone did not flinch. She did not write anything down. She did not shift in her chair. She simply waited, her hands folded on the table, her reading glasses halfway down her nose, the way a person waits when they already know every card in the other player's hand. Foley finished. The courtroom settled into the particular silence that follows an accusation, the held breath moment, where everyone waits to see if the other side will crumble or stand. Judge Caldwell removed her reading glasses and set them on the bench. She looked past Russell Foley, past Wade's satisfied posture, and fixed her gaze on Simone. "Counsel for the respondent," she said, "do you have a response to these allegations?" Simone stood. She buttoned her jacket with one hand, and she smiled, not for the courtroom, not for the judge, but for me. Simone did not raise her voice. She never needed to. The documents did the shouting for her. She stood with that quiet smile still on her face, opened the evidence folder, and began taking apart everything Russell Foley had just spent 10 minutes constructing. She did it the way a surgeon works, precise, unhurried, each cut deliberate. "Your Honor," she said, "the trust in question is irrevocable. It was established by Eugene Ballard in 2014, 8 years before these proceedings. Mrs. Harrington has never had signatory authority, withdrawal rights, or any mechanism to conceal or weaponize these assets." She placed the trust documentation on the table. Mr. Foley's characterization is not merely inaccurate, it is the opposite of the truth. Foley objected. Judge Caldwell overruled him without looking up from the document Simone had placed before her. Simone continued. She placed the second exhibit my handwritten notes from the night of the insult. Date, time, exact words. She placed the third the refinancing papers and the account authorization form from years earlier, the ones I had found in the filing cabinet on a sleepless night in September. "I would direct the court's attention to Exhibit C through F," she said. "These are financial documents Mrs. Harrington was pressured to sign during the marriage without independent legal counsel. The mortgage refinancing transferred her equity to zero. The account authorization granted her husband access to a separate inheritance from her grandmother." She paused. "The pattern before this court is not concealment by the wife. It is control by the husband. If you have ever watched someone try to maintain a lie while the truth is being read aloud in a room full of strangers, you know that the face changes before the words do." Wade's face changed. Not dramatically, he was too practiced for that. But the jaw stopped its confident rhythm. His hands, which had been resting open on the table in the posture Foley had probably coached him to hold, closed into loose fists. Foley objected again. Judge Caldwell overruled him again, this time with a glance that suggested a third attempt would not be received well. Simone let the silence hold for 3 seconds. Then she introduced the final piece of the timeline. "Your Honor, the respondent would like to call attention to a written statement submitted by Declan Harrington, age 13, the couple's son." I gripped the edge of my chair beneath the table. My knuckles went white. I had agreed to this. Declan had chosen this. But watching it happen in a courtroom, watching my son's name spoken into a microphone and recorded by a court reporter was something I could not have prepared for. Simone, read the key portion of the statement aloud. Declan had heard his father use the word parasite on the evening in question and had immediately texted his aunt. She presented the text log with its timestamp corroborating my notes independently, locking the insult into the calendar weeks before I learned the trust's value. Declan was in the gallery. I had not looked at him since the hearing began, because I was afraid that looking at him would break the composure I had spent all morning building. But Judge Caldwell looked at him now. "Young man," she said, her voice softer than it had been all morning. Do you confirm that this written statement is yours and that it accurately reflects what you witnessed? What does it cost a 13-year-old boy to stand in a courtroom and tell the truth about his own father? And how do you ever repay that kind of courage? Declan stood. He was wearing the button-down shirt I had ironed for him that morning. His hands were at his sides. He looked at the judge, not at his father, not at me, but directly at the woman who had asked the question. Yes, ma'am, he said. His voice did not shake. I heard what my father said. I texted my aunt right after because I didn't know what else to do. The court reporter's keys scratched across the silence. I felt my throat close. I pressed my thumb against Eugene's letter through my purse and held on. Wade's head dropped. Not fast, not dramatic. It was the slow, involuntary tilt of a man whose own story had just been told back to him by his 13-year-old son. And it was a different story than the one he had been selling. Wade's confidence did not shatter. It deflated, slowly, like a tire losing air on a long road with no shoulder to pull onto. Foley leaned toward Wade and whispered something. Wade did not respond. He sat with his head lowered and his fists closed on the table and said nothing. Simone returned to our table. She placed one hand flat on a final folder she had not yet opened. It sat between us thin, unmarked, the last piece of something she had been building for months. She looked at me, then at the judge. Your Honor, she said, the respondent has one more piece of evidence to present, and I would ask the court's patience, because what comes next will clarify not only the timeline, but the motive. Foley stood to object. Judge Caldwell raised one hand without looking at him. Proceed, she said. Simone opened the folder. I had imagined this moment so many times that when it finally arrived, it felt like watching someone else's life from the back of the room. Simone lifted the first page from the folder. It was a correspondence log, dates, names, phone numbers. She did not rush. Your Honor, she said, this document records communications between Nadine Whitfield, an administrative employee at Magnolia Trust Services, and Lorraine Harrington, the petitioner's mother. Mrs. Whitfield disclosed confidential details regarding the irrevocable trust established by Eugene Ballard, details she was not authorized to share. Simone placed the page down. Lorraine Harrington then communicated the full details of the trust to her son. 17 days later, Mr. Harrington's attorney filed to postpone this very hearing. The same man who had rushed to file for divorce in November was suddenly asking the court to slow down. The courtroom went still. Not polite stillness, the airless kind, where someone has finally said the thing everyone suspected but no one had proven. The accusation of concealment belongs not to the respondent but to the petitioner, Simone continued. Mr. Harrington did not file because he was deceived. He filed because he discovered his wife's separate inheritance and attempted to claim a share of it. 17 days. That was all it took between Wade learning the full value of the trust and asking the court to delay this hearing. 17 days to decide that 14 years of marriage were worth less than a number on a document he was never meant to see. Foley objected something about relevance and speculation, but Judge Caldwell cut him off with a raised palm. She was reading. She turned one page, then another. The court reporter's keys were the only sound. I sat with my hands folded and felt my pulse in my fingertips. When she finally spoke, Judge Caldwell removed her reading glasses and looked at Wade. Not at Foley, not at Simone, at Wade. Mr. Harrington, she said, her voice carrying the flat, deliberate cadence of someone who had chosen every word before opening her mouth. The evidence before this court indicates that your contempt for your wife preceded any knowledge of inherited assets, and that your filing was motivated not by her deception, but by your discovery of her value. She paused. The air pressed against me like a hand on my chest. You appear to have misunderstood the financial position of your wife. That was the line. The one I had carried in my mind since the first morning I walked into this building, the sentence that started this entire story. It came from a judge in Jackson, Mississippi, and it landed on Wade like a door closing from the inside. Judge Caldwell continued without pause. She read the trust classification into the record separate inherited property, established 8 years before the dissolution, irrevocable by design, outside equitable distribution. She read the verified valuation, $28.7 million in timberland, commercial real estate, and managed investments, held in the name of the trust my grandfather had built. What does that number sound like when a judge says it out loud in a courtroom where your husband just tried to take it from you? It sounds ordinary. It sounds like math. It sounds like a woman reading figures while a man across the aisle realizes he has made the most expensive mistake of his life. A sharp scraping sound came from the gallery. Lorraine stood so fast the woman beside her flinched. Her face had gone white, not pale, white, the color of paper held too close to a lamp. Then her knees gave. Not dramatically, honestly. She sat back down with both hands gripping the pew, staring at something none of us could see. She had known pieces the trust existed. It held timberland. It was worth pursuing. She had never known the whole number. The scale of what she had helped her son try to steal hit her like a physical weight, and her body refused to hold it. Declan was 2 rows behind her. I could feel him watching me, even though I did not turn around. The courtroom smelled like old paper and the stale tension of people sitting too long in a room with no open windows. I thought I would feel triumph. I had earned this moment, every document gathered, every sleepless night, every humiliation swallowed. But what I felt instead was the quiet, heavy sadness of watching someone understand too late what they had thrown away, and knowing that understanding would change nothing. Wade sat perfectly still. Foley was speaking to him, mouth moving, one hand on Wade's arm, but Wade was not listening. He was looking at me, not with irritation, not with dismissal. This was something else. This was a man watching life he had discarded reveal itself to be worth more than the one he had tried to keep. His expression was not anger. It was something closer to late, useless regret, the kind that arrives only after every door has closed. I pressed my thumb against Eugene's letter through my purse and held on. Lorraine had not moved from her collapsed position in the gallery. And I sat there, hands folded, and thought, this is what it looks like when the truth finally costs more than the lie. I heard his footsteps before I heard his voice. The same measured stride he used when he wanted you to know he was coming. The courtroom had emptied behind me. Simone was still inside, gathering documents. Lorraine had not moved from the gallery when I left. I walked into the hallway alone, my heels clicking against the polished tile, and I was halfway to the glass doors at the end of the corridor when those footsteps caught up. "Corrine, wait, please." I stopped. Not because the word please meant anything anymore, but because I wanted to hear what version of himself Wade Harrington would try to sell me now, standing in a courthouse hallway after a judge had just dismantled every lie he had built his case on. I turned around. He was standing too close, the way he always did when he wanted a conversation to feel private. Fluorescent light hung behind him, casting his shadow toward me across the tile. Foley was nowhere. Wade had left his own attorney behind, which meant this was not a legal strategy. This was personal. "Can we talk?" he said. "Just us. Without the lawyers, without the courtroom." He paused, and his voice dropped the way it always dropped when he wanted to sound like a man who was struggling. "Is there a way back from this?" He said it the way he used to say things he wanted me to believe softly, with just enough hesitation to sound like vulnerability. But I had spent 14 years learning the difference between Wade being honest and Wade performing honesty. This was a performance. The rhythm was too practiced. The pause was too clean. Even the way he held his hands open, palms up, like a man with nothing to hide, was the same posture he used in client meetings when he needed someone to trust him before he asked them to sign. If someone has ever asked you to forgive them using the exact same tone they used when they were lying, you know there is no lonelier feeling than recognizing the trick and knowing it used to work. 6 months ago, that voice would have reached me. 6 months ago, I might have turned around and let him reshape the story one more time. But 6 months ago, I had not yet read my grandfather's letter. I had not yet sat across from Simone and watched her build a case out of the truth I had been living inside for years. I had not yet heard my 13-year-old son stand in a courtroom and say the words his father could not. "Wade," I said. My voice was steady. I did not raise it. He stepped closer. I could smell his cologne, the same one he had worn for years, faint now, almost gone by the end of a long day in court. It was the last time I would stand close enough to notice it. A marriage does not end in a courtroom. It ends in a hallway, in a single sentence that takes 14 years to earn the right to say out loud. "You called me a parasite when you thought I had nothing," I said. "Now you want to stay because you know I have everything. That is your answer, Wade. You gave it to me months ago. You just didn't know you were giving it." He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. For the first time in 14 years, Wade had no version of events to offer, no narrative to control, no angle to work. He just stood there with his hands dropping to his sides, watching me, and the hallway was so quiet I could hear the air conditioning cycling through the vents above us. I waited. Not for him to respond, I was past that. I waited because I wanted to see his face when the last door closed. And what I saw was not anger. It was not defiance. It was the slow, bewildered expression of a man who had spent his entire marriage believing he was the one with the power, only to discover in a courthouse hallway that the woman he had dismissed had been the foundation he was standing on the whole time. I turned toward the glass doors. The push bar was cold under my palm. I pressed it, and the Mississippi afternoon came through warm, bright, ordinary. The air tasted like cut grass and open space after hours of recycled courtroom silence. I did not feel powerful walking away from him. I felt light the way you feel when you set down something you have been carrying so long. You forgot it had weight. Every document I had gathered, every night I had spent awake in the guest room reading trust papers, every morning I had made breakfast for my children while my husband's contempt sat across the table like a third person, all of it had led to this hallway, this door, this single step into open air. I did not look back. Not because I hated him, but because I had finally stopped needing him to understand what he had done. Behind me, Wade stood in the hallway. He did not follow. I stepped onto the courthouse steps and took a breath that tasted like the first day of something I did not have a name for yet. The marriage was over. The story was not. The last page of a marriage is not dramatic. It is a signature line, a date, and the sound of a pen being set down on a desk. 3 weeks after I walked out of that courthouse hallway, I sat across from Simone in her office with a stack of documents between us and late afternoon light falling across her conference table. The coffee she had poured me had gone cold. I had not touched it. "Sign here," Simone said, turning a page. "And here." She slid the custody agreement forward. "You'll want to read the summer clause one more time. It specifies alternating weeks in July and shared holidays on a rotating calendar." I read it. I signed it. Every other weekend, alternating holidays, shared summers. The architecture of the family that would continue to exist in a different shape. Simone placed each signed page into a folder with the care of a woman who understood that paperwork could hold the weight of a life. "It's done, Karine," she said. "You did this." I expected to feel something enormous relief or triumph or grief. What I felt instead was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm has passed and you realize you are still standing and the house is still there. The trust was confirmed as separate property. The marital assets had been divided. The man who had called me worthless no longer had any legal claim to the life I was about to build. If you have ever signed a document that ended something you once believed would last forever, you know the pen feels heavier than it should and the ink dries faster than you expect. Simone shook my hand. Then she hugged me. It was the first time she had done that in 9 months of working together, and it told me more about what she had been carrying on my behalf than any billing statement ever could. I held on for a moment longer than I planned. She smelled like coffee and legal paper, and the particular steadiness of a woman who fights other people's battles for a living without ever letting them see her tired. I drove home with the windows down and the radio off. The magnolias along the parkway were blooming. I pulled into the driveway of a house that was now, legally and entirely, mine. 6 weeks later, Wade pulled into that same driveway for his first weekend pickup. He was wearing a polo shirt instead of a suit, the first time I had seen him out of professional clothes on a Saturday in years. He walked up the porch steps while Declan and Poppy loaded their bags into the back seat. He did not come inside. He stood on the porch with his hands in his pockets, and for a long moment he said nothing. The railing was warm from the afternoon sun. I could smell magnolia blossoms and fresh-cut grass and, faintly, the cologne he had worn for years, fainter now, as if even that was receding. "I started seeing someone," he said. His voice was lower and slower than I had ever heard it. "A counselor. She asked me when I started thinking a person's worth was tied to what they earned." He paused. I didn't have an answer. Didn't have any me. What do you do with an apology that arrives months too late and is, for the first time, completely honest? "I'm sorry, Corrine," he said. "Not because of the money. Because of what I said. Because I meant it when I said it, and that's the part I can't take back." There it was. The first honest thing Wade had said in this entire story. Not a performance. Not a strategy. Not the voice he used when he wanted me to believe something. This was a man standing on a porch he no longer owned, admitting that the worst thing he had ever said to his wife was not a mistake. It was the truth of who he had been. And the fact that it was real did not undo a single thing. It did not unwrite the insult. It did not erase the filing. It did not give back the years I had spent shrinking myself to fit inside his definition of enough. But it was a beginning. Not for us that door had closed. For him. Forgiveness is not a door you open all at once. It is a window you crack an inch at a time, and some days you close it again, and that is allowed. "I'm glad you're starting to see it," I said. "That is enough for now." He nodded. He did not ask for more. He walked down the porch steps to his car, where Declan and Poppy were waiting. Poppy waved at me through the window that wide, unguarded wave she had been giving me since she was 3. Declan did not wave. He looked at me steadily through the glass, the way he had looked at the judge, and nodded once. It was the nod of a boy who understood more than any 13-year-old should have to. I watched them drive away and realized I was not dreading the empty house the way I used to. I was looking forward to it, the silence, the space, the freedom to exist without performing contentment for someone who was never watching anyway. But there was one more conversation I needed to have, and it was not with Wade. How many years does a woman have to swallow her own voice before she forgets she ever had one? The conversation I had been putting off found me before I was ready. Lorraine called on a Tuesday morning and said 7 words. "I have something I should have told you a long time ago." No explanation, no small talk, just an address I already knew and a time. I drove to her house in Madison with the windows down and my stomach tight. She opened the door before I knocked. She had been watching from the front window. Her kitchen smelled like dish soap and something baked that morning, probably out of nervous habit. A checked tablecloth covered the table. 2 cups were already set out. She poured the coffee without asking how I took it. She already knew. 2 sugars, no cream. 14 years of holidays and Sunday dinners had taught her that much. We sat. The wall clock ticked. Lorraine held her cup with both hands, the way people hold things when their hands need something to do besides shake. I didn't come to the courtroom to support him, she said. I set my cup down. I came because I needed to see it end. Her voice was low, careful, as though she was testing each word before releasing it. I needed to see someone finally say the thing I never could. I had prepared for deflection. I had prepared for denial. I had not prepared for this Lorraine sitting across from me with her shoulders pulled inward, looking not like the woman who had walked out of that cafe without answering my question, but like someone who had been waiting decades for someone to ask it. If your mother-in-law has ever sat across from you, and you suddenly saw not the woman who judged you, but the woman who was judged first, you know the feeling that hit me at that kitchen table. I owe you an apology, she said. But I owe you the truth first, because the apology won't make sense without it. She told me about Gerald, Wade's father, a man I had met only a handful of times before he died. Quiet, firm handshake, the kind of man people described as old-fashioned, without ever asking what that meant for the woman who lived with him. Gerald used to say I was lucky he kept me around, Lorraine said. Her voice dropped to nearly a whisper when she spoke his name. He said it at dinner, in front of Wade, when Wade was 9-10 years old. I never corrected him. I thought if I stayed quiet, it would pass. She paused. It didn't pass. It became Wade. The clock ticked. The coffee cooled. The afternoon light slid from the window to the wall. Contempt is not born. It is inherited, passed down like a family recipe that everyone follows and no one questions until someone finally tastes it and says, "This is poison." When I heard what he called you, Lorraine said, and she did not say the word she did not need to, I didn't feel shock. I felt recognition, because I had heard that word before. Different mouth, same kitchen. She looked at the tablecloth. Her fingers traced a crease in the fabric. I watched her and saw something I had never allowed myself to see. This woman had not chosen Wade's side out of cruelty. She had chosen silence because silence was the only language she had been taught. Gerald had spent 30 years convincing her that staying quiet was the same as staying safe, and by the time she recognized the pattern repeating in her son's marriage, she had been voiceless for so long that she did not know how to speak. It did not excuse what she had done. It did not undo the leak to Wade, or the years of watching him diminish me without saying a word. But it explained the shape of her silence, and sometimes understanding the shape of a wound matters more than demanding an apology for it. I reached across the table and took her hand. Not because I forgave her, I was not there yet, but because I understood, for the first time, that the woman sitting across from me had been a version of me 30 years earlier, and no one had reached across the table for her. Understanding is not forgiveness. It is the step before forgiveness, the one where you stop resenting someone long enough to see the wound behind the weapon. Her hand was cold. She gripped mine and did not let go. We sat at that kitchen table until the light had moved entirely off the window and the coffee was beyond saving. She told me things about Gerald I had never known: the financial control, the public charm that masked private contempt, the way Wade had learned to measure people by their earning power before he was old enough to understand what earning meant. Then Lorraine said one more thing, and it was the thing that changed everything that came after. Eugene knew about Gerald. He tried to warn me once before the wedding. I didn't listen. She looked at the door, then back at me. He built that trust for you because he couldn't build one for me. You were his second chance to get it right. I drove home in silence. No radio, no phone calls, just the road and the trees and my grandfather's voice in my head, saying through a trust document what he could not say to Lorraine's face 40 years ago. I see what is happening, and this time, I am not too late. I bought a desk, my own desk, not Eugene's, not Wade's, and put it in the room that used to be his home office. After I drove home from Lorraine's kitchen that afternoon, I sat in the driveway for a long time thinking about second chances. Eugene had built something to protect me, because he could not protect her. Now it was my turn to decide what that protection looked like going forward. The first thing I did was call the trust advisors and establish education funds for Declan and Poppy. Structured them the way Eugene would have irrevocable, protected, theirs regardless of what happened between their parents or anyone else. The documents arrived in a thick envelope. I read every page. I understood every clause, and I signed them at my own desk, in my own room, with my own pen. It was the opposite of every document I had signed during my marriage. Every refinancing form, every account authorization, every paper. Wade had slid across the kitchen counter with a casual, "Just sign here, it's fine." All of those had been acts of trust in someone who did not deserve it. These were acts of clarity. I knew what I was giving, and I knew why. Poppy wandered in while I was finishing the last page. She stood in the doorway with a coloring book tucked under her arm. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Making sure you always have choices," I said. She nodded like that, made perfect sense, and went back down the hall. 9 years old, and she already understood the concept better than her father had at 44. If you have ever signed something you did not fully understand because someone you loved told you it was fine, I built what came next for you. The foundation idea started on a Tuesday night. I was sitting at the desk with a cup of coffee brewed the way I liked it now, not the way Wade preferred, and reading an article about financial literacy rates among stay-at-home parents. The numbers were staggering. More than half had never read a joint account statement. Nearly 40% did not know the difference between revocable and irrevocable. 1 in 3 had signed documents during their marriage without independent counsel. I had been every one of those statistics, and now I had the resources to make sure other people did not have to be. I started the paperwork the next morning. A small foundation, not enormous, not flashy, not the kind of thing that gets your name on a building. I thought about naming it after Eugene, but I could hear his voice in my head saying, "Don't put my name on it, put yours." So I did not put anyone's name on it. I called it Second Chance Financial because that was the honest truth of what it was. The curriculum would teach the things I was never taught. How to read a joint account, what irrevocable means, why your name should be on every document you sign, how to recognize the difference between a partner managing finances and a partner controlling them. What is the inheritance worth if you do not use it to make sure no one else has to learn those lessons the way you did alone, in a guest room, at 2 in the morning, with a flashlight and a filing cabinet? I called Faye that evening. My aunt picked up on the second ring, the way she always did. "You want me to help build a curriculum that teaches stay-at-home parents how to protect themselves financially?" she said. There was a pause. Then her voice came back warm and steady. "Corinne, I've been waiting for you to ask me something like this since March." Faye was a guidance counselor. She understood how to teach people things they did not know they needed to learn. She understood how to meet someone where they were and walk beside them without making them feel small. She was the person Eugene had trusted to receive Declan's text on the night everything changed, and she was the person I trusted to help me turn the worst year of my life into something that could matter for strangers. We talked for an hour. By the time I hung up, the desk was covered in notes, curriculum ideas, partnership models, a timeline for the first workshop. The coffee had gone cold again. I did not care. A foundation is just a fancy word for a promise you make to strangers that the worst thing that happened to you will become the best thing that happens to someone else. I turned off the desk lamp and stood in the doorway. Eugene's letter hung on the wall behind the desk in a simple frame. I did not need to read it anymore. I had spent months carrying those words inside my purse, pressing my thumb against the envelope in courtrooms and hallways, and quiet moments when I needed to remember who I was. But I did not need to carry them anymore. I had become what the letter asked of me. Faye's curriculum notes were spread across the desk beside the foundation charter. Downstairs, Declan was helping Poppy with her math homework. I could hear him explaining fractions with a patience that reminded me so much of my grandfather that I had to lean against the doorframe and breathe. This was what the inheritance looked like when you spent it right. Not a number, not a courtroom victory, not revenge. A desk in a room that used to belong to someone else. A foundation named after no one. 2 children doing homework in a house that finally felt like home. Eugene would have approved. Poppy asked me a question on the porch that evening that no therapist, no lawyer, and no judge had thought to ask in 13 months. It was August. The sun was dropping behind the tree line, bleeding orange and pink across the yard. The foundation paperwork was filed. The education trusts were signed. The study that used to be Wade's was mine now, and the house had slowly, quietly begun to feel like a place I had chosen rather than a place I had survived. Poppy was leaning against my shoulder on the porch swing, her bare feet not quite reaching the floor. Declan sat on the steps with a glass of sweet tea balanced on his knee, watching the yard the way boys do when they are thinking about something they are not ready to say yet. "Are you happier now, Mama?" Poppy asked. She said it the way she said most things directly, without warning, the way only a 9-year-old can ask a question that grown adults spend years circling around. "Yes, baby," I said. "I really am." "Good," she said. "You look like it." I pulled her closer. The evening air smelled like warm grass and the last of the magnolia bloom, and for a moment none of us said anything. Then Declan spoke without turning around. "I think Dad's trying too," he said. His voice was careful, not defensive, just honest. "He asked me about school last weekend, like, actually asked." He paused. "He's not good at it yet, but he's trying." I looked at the back of my son's head and felt something I had not expected. Not anger, not resentment, but a small, cautious hope that Wade's counseling might be doing what 14 years of marriage could not. My children deserved a father who was learning, even if he had started too late for me. If you are still waiting for someone to tell you that what you do matters, that raising children, running a household, holding a family together through years of quiet disrespect counts as real work, let me tell you now, it does. It always did. The problem was never the work. The problem was the man who watched you do it and decided it did not count because it did not come with a paycheck. We sat there until the fireflies came out. Poppy counted them, pointing with one finger at each blinking light. Declan pretended not to count along, but I caught his lips moving, and I thought, this is what it sounds like when a family does not end. It just changes shape. After the children were asleep, I went back to the study. Cicadas hummed through the window screen. The room smelled like my own coffee, now not someone else's cologne, not stale ambition, just the quiet scent of a space that belonged to me. I lifted Eugene's letter off the wall and held the frame in both hands. I did not read it as a woman who needed saving anymore. I read it as a woman who had already saved herself and was visiting the place where she first realized she could. His handwriting was steady, the ink slightly faded, the words unchanged. Dignity was the greatest inheritance he could leave me. He had written that 6 months before he died, sitting in a study in Natchez with a brass lamp and a pen, knowing something about his granddaughter's marriage that she had not yet learned herself. I set the frame down on the desk beside Faye's curriculum notes and the foundation charter. The lamp cast a warm circle across the paper's education trusts, workshop outlines, partnership agreements. All of it built from something that was meant to break me. What is a parasite really? Someone who takes without giving? Then what do you call a woman who gave 14 years of her life to a man who never once asked what she needed in return? I will tell you what you call her. You call her a mother. You call her a wife. You call her the person who held everything together, while the man who was supposed to be her partner stood in the kitchen and called her worthless. And then you call her free. If you are listening to this, and someone in your life has made you feel like your contribution does not count because it does not come with a salary, I want you to hear what a judge in Jackson, Mississippi said to my husband in a courtroom in March. You appear to have misunderstood the financial position of your wife. That line was not just about money. It was about every meal cooked, and every child driven to school, and every silent evening endured, and every document signed without understanding, and every year spent believing that love meant making yourself smaller so someone else could feel large. I hung the letter back on the wall and turned off the lamp. The house was quiet. Down the hall, my children were sleeping in rooms that belonged to them, in a home that belonged to me, in a life I had rebuilt with my own hands. I stood in the dark for a moment, the same way I had stood in Eugene's study the night before the hearing. But this time, the dark did not feel like waiting. It felt like rest. The greatest revenge is not proving them wrong. The greatest revenge is no longer needing them to be right about you. I spent 14 years shrinking myself to fit inside someone else's definition of enough. I let a man tell me my work had no value because it did not come with a salary. I signed documents I did not understand because I trusted the person handing me the pen. Do not make my mistake. Do not wait until someone calls you worthless before you learn what you are worth. Read every document. Ask every question. Know your own number before someone else tries to use it against you. This was never a revenge story about money. It was a revenge story about dignity, about a woman who discovered that the greatest inheritance her grandfather left her was not $28 million, but the belief that she deserved better. I believe God put me through every one of those painful nights for a reason, so that my story could reach someone who is sitting where I sat, in a quiet house, wondering if they matter. You do. Your contribution counts. Your presence in your family is not a debt, it is the foundation. And if this revenge story taught me anything, it is that the truth does not need to be loud. It just needs to be spoken. If this story touched something in you, I would love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment and tell me what would you have done in my place. If you know someone who needs to hear this message, please share it with them. And if you have not already, subscribe so you do not miss the next story. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more to me than you know. Some names, locations, and details in this story have been changed for privacy and storytelling purposes. Any resemblance to real individuals is coincidental.